Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for being here. Today I want to talk about Little Red Riding Hood and how modern picture books can change the usual Little Red Riding Hood trope. Little Red Riding Hood is actually one of my favorite fairy tales. I love researching, I love studying it, so I hope that you find this as interesting as I do. As many of us know, literature plays a crucial role in teaching children how to read and write. However, it also plays an essential socializing role in helping them understand the world around them. Children find solace in stories. They can see themselves in the characters they read about and may end up viewing some as their role models. And so, sexist portrayals of girls and women in certain stories can reinforce sexist attitudes in society and influence their psychological development. Children can start recognizing sex role stereotypes by the very young age of 3, which is insane when you think about it. This development of their sexual identity influences children's self-perception, affecting how others treat them and impacts what behaviors they are expected to emulate by their peers and adults. Data analysis by James Hillman shows that from as early as the 1930s, children's literature has reinforced the traditional role of the active male and the passive female. He concluded that in the last 40 years, children's books consisted primarily of men playing central roles, that is, young boys depicted as major characters involved in exciting adventures. This can be easily seen in major book series such as Harry Potter, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which basically features one female character, I think, and the famous 5. This depiction of the differences between the sexes seems to have been universally accepted by many children's authors, unfortunately. Stereotypical portrayals of female characters serve to both internalize the oppression that many women experience and perpetuate sexist attitudes in society. These representations have the power to limit women's views of themselves and their potential, reshaping their conception of what is reasonable and attainable. By perpetuating harmful norms and expectations, these stereotypes can influence how children of different genders perceive and interact with one another, which can impede the process towards gender equality. Fairy tales play a vital role in children's development. They positively affect their emotional well-being by teaching them how to cope with inner turmoil and also how to navigate the next stages of their life. The origins of fairy tales can be traced back to oral storytelling traditions. During the 16th and 17th centuries, fairy tales began to shift from spoken folklore to printed stories aimed at aristocratic and middle-class audiences. As print culture developed, these stories were reshaped and retold to reinforce the dominant patriarchal ideology throughout these centuries. To this day, classical tales such as Little Red Riding Hood, Snow White, and Rapunzel continue to be reimagined, retold, and referenced across various forms of media. As a result, it is more than likely that children will be exposed to fairy tales in some form or another. In one study, researchers spoke with parents of 4-year-old children to learn about how these tales influence them. According to the report, 50% of parents think fairy tales make their kids feel less anxious, especially during bedtime, and 66% of parents use them to teach their kids moral lessons. Most children showed that they liked traditional stories better than the modern ones, and Little Red Riding Hood was one of their favorites, which is very cute. The Little Red Riding Hood tale is rooted in European folklore and has been reinterpreted and adapted countless times throughout history. And while traditional versions often reinforce binary and limiting views of femininity, some contemporary retellings, such as Beth and Wolven's Little Red, which we'll dive deeper into in a second, are actively challenging these entrenched stereotypes, which is very cool. Literary scholar Louis Seyfert argues that fairy tales reflect the cultural values of the societies that produce them, particularly their ideas about gender and sexuality. Their characters often embody highly codified gender roles, meaning that tales such as Charles Perrault's Le Petit Chaperon Rouge, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, can be read not simply as entertainment, but as expressions of 17th century social attitudes. It is also worth noting that women played a major role in the development of the French literary fairy tale. Even though most fairy tale writers during the two vogues were women, Perrault somehow still took the spotlight and was considered one of the most well-known fairy tale writers. A man taking the spotlight, not surprised. For context, 74 published tales between 1690 and 1715 were written by 7 female authors, and 38 were written by 9 male writers. More importantly, evidence suggests that the female storytellers, and not Perrault, sparked the initial popularity towards fairy tales. The fairy tale originated in the mid-17th century saloon, a setting dominated by women, which also nurtured the development of many other literary forms, such as the novel. As fairy tales were rising in popularity, there was significant opposition towards women who wanted to be seen as creative agents of culture and specifically literature. Furthermore, women were increasingly confined to domestic roles, their marital status was strictly regulated, and the debate over women's role in society became a prominent issue, as many wanted to promote the virtues of domestic life. Due to their limited access to formal education, women found fairy tales to be one of the few accepted artistic outlets that they could easily access. Ironically, the association of fairy tales with maternal and domestic life contributed to their marginalization. However, the countesses cleverly turned this marginalization into a source of creativity. Charles Perrault served the French court, was a loyal advocate of Louis XIV's reign, and was also a committed Catholic who believed the church should remain central to French society. Perrault's tales embody these religious and social values written to advocate the ideologies of the court. His tales are explicitly didactic and filled with strong moralizing messages. Le Petit Chaperon Rouge, published in 1697, is generally regarded as the earliest known version of the Little Red Riding Hood tale. However, the tale had circulated orally before Perrault wrote his version. One oral variant, the story of Grandmother, was collected in France around 1885 and later published by the folklorist Paul Delarue in 1951. It preserves features associated with oral storytelling that do not appear in Perrault's version. In The Story of a Grandmother, the heroine is described as direct, courageous, and clever. When she realizes that something is wrong, she asks the wolf and tells him that she needs to relieve herself outside. He tells her to just do it in the bed, but she continues to insist to go outdoors. The wolf eventually ties a woolen thread to her leg and lets her leave. And once she's outside, she attaches the thread to a plum tree and escapes. So, through her courage and quick thinking, she manages to save herself. By contrast, when Perrault adapted the oral tale for publication, he removed several elements that were quite shocking. For example, the girl eating her grandmother's flesh, drinking her blood, and commenting on the wolf's body hair. Maria Tartar suggests that such scenes of violence and impropriety may have made the tale unsuitable for readers expecting a more refined narrative at the time. However, it would be misleading to describe Perrault's version as completely sanitized. In his version, the girl still undresses, gets into bed with the wolf, and is ultimately eaten. What Perrault removes is not the tale's danger, but much of the heroine's independence. As Jack Zipes points out, Perrault's civilized Little Red Riding Hood is helpless and eventually gobbled up. By contrast, the heroine in The Story of a Grandmother, a version closer to the oral tradition, recognizes the danger, tricks the wolf, and escapes, with no help from granny, hunter, or father. So Perrault transforms this clever and self-reliant girl into one who is beautiful but naive and vulnerable. The gendered message becomes explicit in the moral at the end of the story, which warns that young girls, pretty, well-bred, and gentle, should be wary of seemingly charming men. Perrault goes to explain that the most dangerous wolves are not openly violent, but tame, pleasant, and gentle, following young women right into their homes, into their chambers. The wolf here, therefore, is clearly representing a male sexual predator, while any responsibility for avoiding him is placed on the young women instead of the predator himself. Rather than teaching girls how to confront danger, the moral encourages caution, restraint, and suspicion. Zipes argues that Perrault adapted the story to match the social and aesthetic expectations of his educated upper-class audience. Its emphasis on modesty, obedience, and female vulnerability reflects a culture that valued women who were attractive, loyal, and docile. The tale can therefore be read as reinforcing male authority rather than encouraging female independence. This interpretation also fits the historical context, as the French literary fairy tale emerged under Louis XIV during a period shaped by absolutism, the Counter-Reformation, and increasingly restrictive attitudes towards women. Female desire and independence were often presented as threats to the Christian and patriarchal social order. At the time, it was thought that the opera and other art forms were driving women to madness and adultery. Make it make sense. So basically, Perrault's version of the Little Red Riding Hood tale reflect these anxieties, and by removing the heroine's successful escape and replacing it with punishment and a moral lesson, the tale turns an active girl into a cautionary example. It is not simply a story about a girl and a wolf, it is also a story about the kinds of behavior expected from young women in Perrault society. Luckily, children today are not limited to these traditional versions of the tales, as contemporary authors are reworking these stories. They're challenging these stereotypes and offering young readers different kinds of protagonists. So instead of presenting Little Red Riding Hood as a passive and vulnerable girl, certain retellings, such as Bettina Wolven's Little Red, reimagine her as strong, resourceful, and in control of her own story. Perrault describes Little Red Riding Hood as the prettiest girl you can imagine, who was spoiled by her doting mother and grandmother, who gave her a red hood as a gift which she wears everywhere because it suits her. And so everyone knew her by the name Little Red Riding Hood wherever she went. Perrault goes to excessive lengths to draw a vivid portrait of Little Red Riding Hood for his readers. She's seen as a distinctly special girl with clear and individualistic traits. The tale hints at her pampered, sheltered upbringing and highlights her vanity. Not only is she described as the prettiest girl, but she is also acutely aware of it. Accustomed to being spoiled and the center of attention, one might say she exhibits a touch of self-absorption. These character details can be interpreted as a cautionary message to young girls that vanity and being overly indulged might attract the wrong kind of attention, particularly from predatory men, or in this case wolves, who are all too eager to prey on them. Furthermore, her famous red hood is a color that attracts attention. In Christian theology, the color red was associated with sin, sexuality, sexual passion, and the devil. During the reign of Louis XIV, women were seen as a threat to the Christian man and thought to be inherently sinful and descendants of the corruptess Eve. They were thought to wield a unique corruptive influence, employing spells, charms, and sorcery to lure men into sins of the flesh. Therefore, through a combination of her clothing, physical appearance, and social traits, Perrault portrays this young girl as somewhat of a provocateur. On the other hand, Bettina Wolven's Little Red is drawn with simple, understated features. This Little Red Riding Hood lacks the stereotypical markers usually associated with femininity, such as rosy cheeks, long flowing hair, or radiant smile, which is seen in many other Little Red Riding Hood picture books. Little Red, not showcasing typical feminine features, also allows children of different genders to relate to her story. Wolven illustrates her in stark black and white with only her red cap and shoes providing a splash of color. The author and illustrator seem to use the color red to draw attention to her, but in a way that does not insinuate sin or wrongdoing. The red in this version does not imply that it is Little Red's responsibility to avoid attracting attention. It emphasizes that it is the man's responsibility to control his predatory behavior, because if he does not, he's the one who will get punished. And so, this Little Red is not seen as naive, vain, or self-absorbed, but practical, self-assured, and unafraid. In Perrault's version, Little Red encounters the old neighborhood wolf, insinuating that anyone of familiarity could be a threat to a little girl. As this moral goes, some wolves are perfectly charming, not loud, brutal, or angry, but tame, pleasant, and gentle. following young ladies right into their homes, into their chamber. This moral once again suggests that any man could pose a potential threat, implying that a predatory nature lurks within all men, ready to emerge at any moment. Perrault seems to insinuate that men are inherently inclined to seduce young girls, treating this behavior as an inevitable aspect of male nature. The narrative reinforces the idea that all men have a singular desire when it comes to the opposite sex, to deceive and lure naive young girls into their homes. Perrault's wolf would have eaten her right there on the spot, were it not for the male woodcutters in the forest. Although they do not actively rescue Little Red Riding Hood, their presence temporarily prevents the wolf from attacking her, associating male authority with protection and social order. By contrast, women of all ages remain vulnerable even within the supposed safety of their own homes. The narrative therefore suggests that women must remain constantly alert, particularly when male protection is absent. Perrault writes, "The poor child did not know that it was dangerous to stop and listen to wolves. She naively engages in conversation with the wolf and tells him not only why she is going to her grandmother's, but also precisely where her grandmother lives. Her decision to linger alone in the woods gathering nuts, chasing butterflies, and picking bunches of flowers that she found in an area that is known to be dangerous seems particularly foolish." The narrative presents this behavior as careless and undisciplined, placing some responsibility for her fate on her failure to recognize this danger. Perrault therefore portrays femininity as innocent, gullible, and vulnerable to predatory men. This moralizing structure can be examined through Michel Foucault's ideas about discipline and social control. Rather than controlling behavior only through direct force, power can operate by establishing accepted standards of conduct and showing the consequences of breaking them. Perrault's tale disciplines its audience, particularly young women in this case, by presenting Little Red's death as the result of her failure to behave cautiously. Her punishment acts as a warning, encouraging readers to internalize these expectations and regulate their own behavior. So, in this sense, the tale contributes to a regime of truth in which particular ideas about proper female behavior are presented and as natural and necessary. In contrast, Woven's Little Red is portrayed with a completely different demeanor. Here, the wolf might have scared some little girls, but not this little girl. Woven's wolf dominates the spread, appearing large, menacing, and intimidating with his sharp teeth. He is obviously a predator, as he looks down at Little Red Riding Hood with a sly grin. However, Little Red stares up at him with a blank expression, maybe even boredom, showing neither fear nor naivety. She is portrayed as a strong girl who is not afraid of predators and can take care of herself. While she does disclose where she is going and why, she does so with far less detail than in Perrault's version. She does not get distracted on her way to her grandmother's house, and instead, the wolf takes a shortcut, eats the grandmother, puts on her glasses and spare nightdress, climbs into her bed, and not long after, Little Red arrives. But instead of blindly entering her grandmother's house, she peeps in through the window to quickly realize that there is a badly disguised wolf waiting in grandma's bed, which might, once again, have scared some little girls, but not this one. So she made a plan and she went inside. She wasn't fooled for a minute, but chooses to play along with the wolf's disguise. She rolls her eyes and she goes on to ask the familiar questions around what big ears you have, and what big eyes you have, and what big teeth you have. In Perrault's version, these questions reveal Little Red's inability to recognize danger. However, in this version, she already understands the situation and deliberately allows the wolf to believe that he has deceived her. Here, she's not just a passive participant in her story, but an active agent who navigates the world on her own terms. This reversal is particularly significant in the context of picture book illustration. Research has shown that female characters are often placed in passive or observational roles, while male characters are more often represented as active and adventurous. Woven rejects this convention by placing a girl at the center of the action. Little Red displays intelligence, courage, and autonomy, qualities that older stories have often associated with male protagonists. Final image of Little Red wearing the wolf skin symbolizes this reversal of power. She is no longer defined by her vulnerability to the predator. Instead, she has defeated him and turned his threatening appearance into a sign of her victory. By removing the need for a male rescuer, Little Red is seen as fully capable of confronting danger on her own. The persistent presence of gender stereotypes in literature, particularly in fairy tales such as this one, have long influenced societal views on femininity and female behavior. An increasing number of writers, along with numerous feminist critics, both men and women, are striving to expose these stereotypes. They recognize that the fairy tales of their childhood stamp their present actions and behavior into reality, highlighting the profound impact that stories can have on shaping attitudes and behaviors. Furthermore, M.K. Redman asserts that overall we should avoid gender stereotyped uniforms, and that all genders should be portrayed as logical or emotional, depending on the context, rather than being confined by these gender stereotypes. Their reliance on or independence from others should also be determined by the situation, not by perceived gender roles. In conclusion, Bethan Wolven's Little Red offers an alternative to Perrault's passive heroine. This story demonstrates how familiar fairy tales can be revised to provide children with a broader and more empowering representation of girlhood. In the grand scheme of things, there are many stories nowadays that are being published that do challenge these types of stereotypes. However, for there to be a change on a societal level, there needs to be sufficient numbers of stories with girl protagonists to normalize a broad range of female experience, and they of course need to be widely read. So these stories are important not because they replace one restrictive model with another, but because they give children more possibilities for understanding what girls can do and how they can act. Thank you so much for watching and for listening to me. Let me know if you have any thoughts below. I would love to continue discussing this topic. And also, if you've come across any interesting Little Red Riding Hood retellings, I would love that. And that's it. I'll see you soon with another video. Bye bye.